true separation of powers is a separation of the power to tax from the power to spend. And that we should follow the Swiss model, where the legislature cannot increase taxes without the approval of the cantons. How do you think that would affect tax policy?
Oh, that's absolutely necessary to have that type of check and balance there. More than a few people thought I was a little out there reading this book when I was on planes. I was reading this book on the history of civilization and tax policy and the nexus between the two. But it's a very good book, and I encourage you all to maybe check that out if you have some time for reading.
What's the title again?
The formal title.
It's called Good and Evil: The Impact of Taxation on Civilization. It's by Charles Adams.
It's a fantastic read. It goes through many of the civilizations and their history with how taxation kind of worked with that. And I think that's really a great lesson to be learned, in that we have to make sure that that there's some limits on spending, because there's really, those are two sides of the same fiscal coin. But there should be some sort of a supermajority or voter approval or some sort of an extra hurdle on raising taxes or raising spending. Now, you can choose to focus on either side, but at the end of the day, they're really kind of the same thing. That's something we've been working on at ALEC for years, and trying to isolate out in terms of the state level of what works the best at limiting the growth of government, whether it's spending or taxes. We think at the state level, one of the best things you can do is what the state of Colorado did in the early 1990s, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights it was called. This has been something that millions have been spent against the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights by the left, because they realized how effective it was at limiting the growth of government spending to population and inflation. So basically taking a metric of how fast the private sector is growing and limiting constitutionally with teeth, limiting the growth of the state government to that rate of the private sector. Because if we can do that with some sort of institutional control, you get away from this problem that we've had 90% faster growth in government than we have in the private sector, which is supposed to support the government in just the last 10 years. There has to be some sort of institutional control there. And that's something we've done quite a bit of work on. We have been working with legislators in other states to kind of frame that at the state level. At the national level, obviously, that's a trickier topic, just because there's, the numbers are bigger, the enemies are bigger at the national level, and there's that much more power there at the national level of people that make their living in industries that make their living off of the tax code and off of appropriations, and off of earmarks and that type of thing. And so I think what we need to have is some sort of a national institutional framework, whether it's probably a constitutional amendment. That's going to have to be something in the discussion. That's a huge lift, obviously. It doesn't happen that often. We're less than 30 amendments in our well over 200-year history. And so we have a big task ahead of us here. Some of us are taking a look at a federal balanced budget amendment, which is the publication I talked about. And that, if you design it properly, could be something like a balanced budget amendment, which would limit the growth of the federal government to the private sector or to some sort of a metric, or require voter or supermajority of the legislator approval of any tax increases. Something like that is certainly a possibility. And I think that is really one of the keys that we can use at the national level to try to bring about this type of check and balance and institutional control. Because certainly what we've witnessed is, the tendency of government is always to grow and grow and grow. And while we see the business cycle at the private sector level, the government growth trajectory is always something that's almost a direct growth, and in some cases exponential growth. And this has happened, of course, among Republican and Democrat administrations alike. In sometimes the best cases, we can slow the growth, or we can maybe at the best case make it static, but it's been very rare that we've had a long period at the federal level that actually has realized any type of control and reduction in budget spending. So I think that type of institutional control is going to be necessary to really do this long term.
Yeah, I have two questions. What happens if we don't get that right? What do you see down the road? What are the consequences? And the second question is, I'd like your take on the fair tax.
Sure. Well, let me take the first one first. If we don't get it right, you're going to see the acceleration, I think, of the loss of American competitiveness vis-a-vis other places in the world. I still believe that America is the best place on the face of the earth, and it certainly should continue to be. But we have to do as many things as we can to make sure that we do remain competitive. Let me give you I was scared. This was several weeks ago. I spent a couple of weeks in Asia over New Year's, and I was in Hong Kong. And you know what? That is a scary place if you think about it from American competitiveness standards. That's a place that realizes that competitiveness is key, realizes the value of entrepreneurship to make sure government stays out of the way of people doing entrepreneurial activities. Now, the mainland Chinese that have had that for about 10 years now have been smart enough to not get in the way of the entrepreneurial drive of Hong Kong and the competitiveness of Hong Kong. They may start to crack away at some of the personal liberties at some point, but in terms of the economic liberties, many of them are still there. Hong Kong is a very good place to do business still. But you know what? If we're not careful, we're going to continue the slide of U.S. competitiveness versus places like that, versus even, I hesitate to say this, even Europe is much more competitive than we are in a lot of cases. Believe it or not, we have the second highest corporate income tax in the world today in the United States. Our corporate income tax is higher than France's, it's higher than Sweden's income tax, it's higher than these places we love to ridicule as being socialist areas. Our corporate taxes are worse than theirs. And as I talked about earlier, is we have capital has a choice where to go, and people do not take capital where their after-tax rate of return is lower than other places. That's just the way it works. And if Eastern Europe, for instance, is getting it right, where they're having zero corporate income tax or flat tax regimes in parts of Eastern Europe, you're seeing massive capital flows from Western to Eastern Europe. But at the end of the day, we're not just competing against Canada and Mexico. We're competing against capital all across the world. And one of the things that I find kind of stark on this debate is Chairman Dave Camp of the House Ways and Means Committee said that in 1960, 17 of the 50 largest multinational companies were located in the United States. You know how many are located in the United States today? 6. 6 of 50 is all the amount of multinational largest companies are located within the United States. And there's a reason for that. There is a reason why it's Daimler Chrysler and not Chrysler Daimler. And that's because we are failing competitiveness on the international scale. And if we do not get spending under control at the national level, if we do not get tax reform under control at the national level to be able to get rates down and become competitive with our trading partners and other major countries, we're going to continue this slide, and we're going to see that trend, which is very disturbing, continue. And the second part of your question is, I think on the fair tax, at the state level, I'm a huge proponent of the fair tax because that is exactly what the 9 states without income taxes are. They're fair tax states at the state level. Now, at the national level, it's a little bit more complicated to get it done. There's bigger numbers in play. There's international aspects at play that are not at play at the state level. Now, I think that from a strategic point, I would like to see another state eliminate its income tax and prove all the critics of the fair tax wrong, that a state can actually get rid of its income tax. The 9 states that don't have income taxes today, only one of those states eliminated its income tax. The other 8 have never had them in their state's history. In some cases, they're constitutionally prohibited from having an income tax. The only state to ever repeal its income tax was Alaska. And they did that about 30 years ago, and they had some very inherent advantages based on oil revenue that they were able to use to get it done. Now, I think income taxes are the opiate of government. Once you're addicted to the income tax revenue, it's very, very, very difficult to get unaddicted from the revenue. Alaska was able to do it. I would like to see a victory at the state level where a state can say, this is the fair tax model, it's worked in these 9 states, and we're going to show how the transition from an income tax state to a non-income tax state works. And I'd like to see that, and I'd like to see that work, and I'd like to see it really quiet all the critics out there, because we do have some great models of the fair tax. People forget that the non-income tax states are fair tax states in a way. And I think I would like to see another victory at that before the national. But I mean, I think we fight on. I think at the national level, getting away from the income tax reliance is a great tool. Going to more of a consumption tax base, that's something that economists generally think is much better for growth. They think there could be a big growth dividend from switching off of an income to a consumption base. The difficulty is, of course, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. We would have to repeal the 16th Amendment, which would disallow a federal income tax. Because before 1913, there was no such thing as a federal income tax, except for a very brief period during the Civil War, which President Lincoln convinced the Supreme Court that income tax was okay to fund the Civil War. Now, based in 1913, you had the Wilsonian period, and you had the progressives taking over. You had direct election of senators happen, and you also had the federal income tax happen in around 1913. Since that, this creates a very dangerous scenario for us to enact a consumption tax while the 16th Amendment is in place. We'd have to repeal the 16th Amendment, which would be obviously a very time-consuming process with a ton of effort, a ton of resources expended. But you cannot have a consumption tax with the income tax framework in place. I loved, Herman Cain's 999 plan, and it had some tremendous benefits to growth, I think, but the one challenge was you do run the risk of having the income tax framework in place and then having, over time, if you allow government to grow, and if you don't have the institutional controls that you're talking about, you could have 20-20-20 or 40-40-40 and end up very close to Western Europe in terms of their welfare state. So that's my, long answer to a short question.
Kind of takes off on the previous gentleman's question. If we move to a flat tax or a fair tax, businesses currently are able to depreciate capital. Have you studied the effect on businesses not renewing equipment because there's no tax advantage to it? If there was a fair tax, they would be repairing old equipment for a longer period of time, and that would slow down other industries.
Well, I haven't looked at that. I haven't actually run any of the numbers on that myself. One of the things you could say, though, is it's certainly at a flat tax level. You could have immediate expensing. You could do all the same things that you do with that type of a help that the income tax can give to those industries through a flat tax. If you're going to keep an income tax base, just make sure it's a flat rate and it disallows many of the credits, deductions, exemptions that currently plague the code. That make it 10 million words long with its code, with its rules and instructions. The other piece of that is obviously with the fair tax, you do away with all the income taxes. So some of the necessity there for the write-offs kind of goes away because you have a much easier situation in terms of your income statements. So you're not paying taxes at all on the income tax side. That certainly would do a lot to help. The other thing is sometimes with those type of considerations, a lot of times it just shifts the consumption earlier on, maybe like you were saying, and maybe they would use older equipment longer. So there may be some sort of impact on those industries, for instance, that manufacture the equipment that would be used longer, the usable life would maybe be extended, and so you may have some impact there. I don't know, I haven't isolated that out there personally.
I would guess a technological change would require companies to modernize based on their markets.
Yeah, they may.
In your opinion, have we reached the point of no return? If not, how long do you think that the government on its present trajectory, we will reach the point where we will be filing again for bankruptcy in the United States?
Well, this is the question, of course, that divides optimists and pessimists, right? And I'm an optimistic kind of guy, so I don't think that we have passed the point of no return in terms of getting our financial situation in order. I think that there is still hope. I mean, Arthur Laffer, he's an incredible optimist. He said, you give me the right administration along with the legislative majority, and we can undo quite a bit of what's been done in 4 years. I mean, obviously Ronald Reagan came into a pretty difficult situation. You had the Jimmy Carter years where obviously inflation, you had hyperinflation, you had stagflation in many cases, you had weak economic growth, you had high interest rates of 20%, you had inflation, double-digit inflation. And he came in and was able to right the ship. Of course, you had in a way, if you want to consider Richard Nixon a Republican, you had a Republican, of course, before that had not done all those things. Of course, Richard Nixon was Ralph Nader's favorite president. And he created the EPA and created a lot of things that conservatives are somewhat loath to talk about. Of course, price controls, and you had all of that very anti-free market things going on in the 70s that complicated things for Ronald Reagan. And he came in. He did not have a very friendly Congress for most of his time. We had Tip O'Neill, his sparring partner there. But you know what? He came in and he reduced income taxes. Believe it or not, many of you paid these income taxes if you were making a lot of money in the 80s. But I mean, 70% marginal income tax rates at the federal level before Reagan. Before JFK, it was 90% personal income tax at the federal level at the highest bracket. Reagan got it down to 28% by the time he left office, and he did that with the Democrat majority in the House of Representatives. Of course, parties have changed a little bit since then. He had a lot of conservative Democrats from the South that he could work with. But he was able to make those kind of changes. The 1986 Tax Reform Act, for instance, that I talked about, which was the last time we majorly reformed our federal tax code, and since that time, 14,000 changes have been made. He sat down with Tip O'Neill. He sat down with Bill Bradley, former senator from New Jersey, not a conservative guy, with Dick Gephardt, and then with Bob Dole and a couple of others, Dan Rostenkowski, very liberal Democrat from the Chicago machine. He sat down and they undertook this fundamental tax reform to simplify the code and to make taxes more competitive. He was able to do it, and I think that if he was able to do it in the 1980s, of course I'm very much simplifying those accomplishments. You could go on and on about the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of those important things. But if Reagan was able to do it, he'd face some pretty difficult situations, and I think that we could have a future Reagan out there that could get this done given the right circumstances. So that's why I think I continue to be an optimist.
Yeah, Jonathan, at the state level, could you prioritize, in order for us, tax policies that would most likely re-incentivize business growth, job growth, and economic growth in a state?
Well, I think that generally when it comes to tax policy is you have to look at it in terms of what are the principles that govern good, effective, pro-growth tax policy. And I think you look at those principles, and they are simplicity is the first one, is that you must have a simple tax system that people understand their tax bill. They don't have to spend a lot of deadweight loss and time and effort just calculating and trying to figure out what they owe and hiring folks to try to figure that out. And plus, of course, they're liable for any mistakes that they make. That's a big, big problem. You have the issue of transparency in taxes, that people ought to know who's taxing them, how much they're being taxed. That makes a very good pro-growth tax system. You have neutrality, I think, is another very important principle, and that's the principle of government not picking winners and losers through tax policy. That always runs into hurdles when it comes to growth, because this is the fatal conceit, of course, that Friedrich Hayek talked about in his work, is that what single actor, and especially a very inefficient government appropriations or government tax policy committee, can get it right in terms of deciding which winners and losers to put the bets on, versus the combined knowledge of the free market of all the folks out there based on our price signal systems being able to invest in what needs to be invested in. Government just isn't good at picking winners and losers. As I mentioned, Solandra, case in point. So that's another one. And I think finally, you ought to have, I shouldn't say finally, I think predictability is key for a pro-growth system, because as businesses are going and looking to invest in a state or in a nation, they want to know that their investment's going to be treated well even after they put down $1 million or $1 billion for infrastructure or plant or something like that. They want to make sure the rules of the game are not going to be changed after they make the investment. That's one of the keys to how states have gotten it right, that they've just not messed with the tax code and not tried to pick winners and losers and change the rules of the game. And then finally, I should say that all of the previous conditions are probably necessary but not sufficient conditions for good pro-growth policy at the state level. The final is most important, and that is the overall principle of competitiveness in pro-growth policy. And it is, take a look at where your neighbors are at. Take a look at where your trading partners are at in terms of tax policy. What if you were a capital manager and trying to look at investing and just remove yourself from your current location and say, if I was going to start a business, all else being equal, where at the margins is the most lucrative place to start a business? Where are competing jurisdictions? And then make sure that your tax rates aren't out of line with the places that are competing jurisdictions and trading partners. There is a real problem how the United States has gotten out of control with our corporate tax rate being so far outside of the mainstream. States are the same way. And of course, with Hawaii, 11% personal income tax, that's really concerning. And of course, since most small businesses across the country pay on the individual side instead of the corporate tax side, that's a big inhibitor to future small business growth. And of course, the new startups, the new entrepreneurs are exactly the type of people that you want coming to Hawaii to make their investments here. That's where the new net job creation is. You've heard the numbers that the Fortune 500 haven't created a whole lot of net new jobs over the last 20 years. The new net jobs being created across America are coming from the small startups and the entrepreneurs. Those are the people that you want to be cognizant of. And currently the tax code's stacked against them here. But those are the principles by which I like to talk about pro-growth policy.
So if you're talking about pro-growth and you're talking about having a really high tax rate, not to mention the GET, so on that 11%, you add another 4. And you're also talking about we have a debt individually of $27,000 per person. What do we do as a state to change that around?
Well, I would suggest that legislators take a look at the budget reform toolkit. 25 suggestions how to reform a state budget and to get a budget deficit under control without raising taxes. Because you've got to probably draw a line in the sand that 11% is awfully high, and you probably shouldn't go higher than that if you want to be in the realm of possibility for folks that are looking to invest versus other locations. Now, obviously, some people would invest based on if they're a photographer, for instance, they might like Hawaii. And there's a lot of beautiful sunsets here over other states. There are some inherent advantages that you do have. Now, that being said, there are a lot of other states that don't have those inherent advantages that are doing better. And how do we change things around that you're able to compete with those other states where all else being equal, you ought to be able to surpass all those other states just because of those and some of the inherent advantages that you have here. And so I think that taking a look, drawing a line in the sand and saying, even though we do have a shortfall of $25,000 per person, tax increases are not going to make the problem better. They're going to make the problem worse because you're on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. When you raise tax rates at this point, you're going to see a diminishing return on your revenue as you're driving more and more people off or going back onto the mainland, moving off of Hawaii, and also maybe keeping people from coming here that would have come otherwise. So that's going to be key. Is that it's a nuanced argument to make. Is that you need to, in a way, reduce some taxes in order to produce more revenue. Now, let me just address this briefly, is that sometimes people have gotten a little bit carried away with supply-side economics that say all tax cuts automatically pay for themselves. No, that is not true. Not all tax cuts will pay 100% of the revenue that you've used to cut them. You have two effects when you look at tax policy. You have your arithmetic effect and you have your economic effect. That is, the arithmetic effect is if you reduce taxes by a certain rate, you're going to see exactly that loss in revenue. The economic effect makes up for the arithmetic effect in many cases in some percentage. It's not always 100%. In many cases, it's never 100% depending on the tax, but it's never 0% either. And so keeping that in mind, some people have taken it a little too far to say that all tax cuts pay for themselves. That's not the case. So you have to be honest with the fact that you may have to give up some extra revenue to reduce the top marginal rate on personal income to get the GET under control and to work on other anti-business taxes that are in existence to make it more competitive. But if you get the general competitiveness picture right, you're going to see more people taking a look at Hawaii as a viable option and saying, not only do they have great beaches, they have a decent business climate here that we can conduct our business, and maybe good place to start our business. A lot of people talking about retiring maybe here, but they may be people that want to start a business as well in retirement, retire early. Following those principles that I talked about for pro-growth principles and viewing everything through that lens is going to be key. Of course, the challenge is you can't print money at the state level, as we said. You've got to balance the budget at some point, and so going through the budget and developing what I like to call a priority-based budget, I think is going to be key for Hawaii's future and getting the budget under control. And let me tell you a quick case study on the best place that has actually used this is Washington State, not a conservative state. Democrat Governor Gary Locke, who then went on to be now ambassador to China under President Obama currently. He was governor. He worked with a bipartisan group of legislators in Washington State. They had I believe it was a $2.8 billion shortfall following the 9/11 tragedy and the downturn. And what they said is our economy is too weak to withstand a tax increase at this point. We're a state without an income tax, and we're not going to raise our sales tax. And they said, let's go through and prioritize our spending. And what they did was they found out that state agencies in Washington State did not even have to have a mission statement as to why they existed before this exercise of priority-based budgeting. That is, they're spending billions of dollars across the state, but yet having no barometer as to judge, whether a program is successful or not, and not even having the basic step of having the agency director say why that agency should exist and what type of value it provides for taxpayers. That was one exercise they did, and it was very effective. Agencies came back and said, here are our missions, and then they found there are a lot of programs in those agencies that didn't necessarily comply with the mission that it was stated. And so that was one really easy first outcome. Then the other was they had a $2.8 million budget shortfall in a $28 billion budget, biennial budget. And they said basically got to take off 10%. And so they drew a line in the sand. They started prioritizing. They said these are the most vital. Here are the agencies or areas of the budget that the state constitution says we must do. Here are the things that our citizens demand. Here are the most popular services that we provide. And then, after they listed everything there, they had a cut line. And everything that fell below the cut line was not renewed or scaled down, and they found their savings that way. And they did not raise a dime of tax increases to get to that budget shortfall of $2.8 billion that they solved. And it's really basic stuff. I mean, it's what we do in the private sector all the time. It's what you do as in a personal budget. You're balancing your budget on a regular basis. Businesses balance their budgets, and because we prioritize, we have to decide between needs and wants. And really, the key to good budgeting is the ability to say no. And that's not something that we do enough at the state government level. And priority-based budgeting is something that never do you see states do, outside of the rare occasion of Washington State where they were really against the wall. But they ruled out tax increases first, and that was the spigot that they shut off to say, no, we're not raising taxes. We don't want to go down that path of being less competitive. Let's live within our means. And that was the solution to Washington State. So I think developing a priority-based budget for Hawaii will allow you to help whittle down that $25,000 per person shortfall that you're facing, while keeping a lid on taxes and not even throwing yourself ahead of Oregon. I know there's tax competition out there, but that's not the type of tax competition you want. You don't want to be the top income tax in the country. All right, right here.
I taught high school for 25 years, and somehow everything you said is very refined, educated, and it's a paradigm that everybody can follow. But you've got to win over the American public. They can't even spell the word economics, let alone follow what you're saying. And at some point, you've got to sell the concept of economic financial reform. You've got a tough job. They just don't get it. And these are fairly people who are successful. They cannot understand the economics. How are you going to overcome that social wall that you're going to hit out there?
Well, I mean, it's certainly can be a challenging task for a lot of folks that just don't follow this on an average basis. But I mean, that's part of the value, I think, that's inherent of the Tea Party movement, is that all of you go back to your neighborhoods, you go back to your Rotary clubs, you go back to the water cooler at the office, and you're telling people, hey, I just heard this presentation the other night, and here's how bad of shape Hawaii's in, and here's what other states have learned, and that type of thing. That's the type of value that you can take back to your communities, and not something that, you know, a lot of people are going to listen to a talking head or a wonk such as myself and be able to really, you know, have any interest in it. That's why we don't have 3,000 people here tonight. As you know, a lot of people would be rather watching, you know, Hawaii 5-0 or something like that. But you know, I think it's, you know, person to person and talking, you know, hey, you know, did you see we're in at $25,000 per person in the hole here, and then you know, maybe having them draw some curiosity and why is that the case, and you know, maybe the National Debt Clock website to put that out there on your Facebook pages, and you know, talk to people and send it around and say, hey, we have a real problem here. We you know, we're that much in the hole. We've got a real American competitiveness problem. And you know, I think at the basic level though is that you know, I think people get it when it hits home, obviously, and when people are, you know, when people are unemployed, when people are wondering why there's no new jobs being created in a particular place. You know, my home state has really gone through it. I mean, I'm from Michigan. We understand that kind of, it hits home awfully hard. People are asking the questions. Now, I think that's a vacuum. They don't automatically gravitate to our point of view. And in many cases, it's much easier, it's a more simple solution to sometimes just blame big business. And you know, you see that through the Occupy movement, and people are just misinformed. They're directing their anger, which is legitimate, at their situation and maybe the country's situation. They're directing it in the wrong place, and so there's a vacuum that we need to fill that space, and that's where it's key to be, you know, reaching out there and talking and telling our side of the story. I think that's really the solution, because you know, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to maybe even ever watch a presidential debate. They may never vote in an election. And then you know, it's up to us to connect on a more personal basis, I think.
We got to get this debt clock information out to everyone, the students. You can't depend on high school teachers these days to educate. Turn on your computers and go to debtclock.org. They won't do it. There's a dumbing down where they don't want people. They want the blinders on. That's my opinion, but they don't want us to know. So anyway, I was going to ask you, and as an aside to that, about the accuracy and the source of the information of the U.S. debt clock. Do you have any idea about the source?
Well, I think the source for most of it is the official government statistics, and then I don't know how much they extrapolate beyond, because you know, the problem with government statistics is they're awfully stale sometimes, and of course they're not, you know, they're always up to date. They're always having the zeros cranking out there and so many different decimal points. Makes the eye turn, of course, but I'm not exactly sure how they get around that problem of government data being very choppy and not being always timely either. So I don't know the mechanism behind it. I'd be quite curious to find that out myself.
Well, it's a pretty scary website. People go there and the numbers are changing so fast they just go somewhere else. And I've done some exploring around that website, and there's a little box off to the left at the top which you can bring up the debt clock for each state. And I don't know, have you ever gone there?
Yeah, I've seen that. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, I had a printout here of the Hawaii debt clock and the numbers on there. And anyone in this room can go to debtclock.org and then click on the state and click on Hawaii. And then you can go around the country too, and you find out New York is really in bad shape.
What's the current number for Hawaii? I'm curious.
Well, the current debt is $11.5 billion. 1.3 million people. The debt to GDP ratio is 16.7. I think New York is like 28.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's pretty scary. I mean, we're not that far behind where Greece was a couple of years ago in terms of our debt to GDP. And I don't know if you saw it. I think it was yesterday. S&P, or one of the bond rating agencies, downgraded France. They lost their AAA rating. They downgraded many other European nations. Italy got another whack at it. And so, I mean, this is just another reason why, you know, financial reality is not negotiable. At some point, the piper is going to have to be paid. And right now, I mean, we of course witnessed this losing our AAA rating earlier this year. We're seeing the consequences of that. You know, I think that's an awfully dangerous place to be if all of a sudden if foreign investors start requiring a higher rate of return on U.S. treasuries, which inevitably they will as the ratings go down. The cost of borrowing continues to rise, and it becomes a larger and larger percentage of the federal budget just goes to automatic interest payments, and then, not to mention all the other autopilots that we're already on with Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and those type of areas. That's a very dangerous piece.
John, as you travel the country, following up on his point, which I think is extremely well taken, do you sense an understanding of the debt that we actually are experiencing in each state and nationally? Number one. And number two, do the people you talk to and you interview seem to care? And number three, are they ready to do something about it this year?
Well, I mean, to answer your first question is, unfortunately, no. I don't think that the most people really understand how bad the situation is in a lot of cases, because to an average person, you see a few zeros, and then you see a few more zeros, and you don't necessarily, a billion, a million, they're all pretty big numbers. And unfortunately, I think you see a lot of that happening is all, well, we're up, to 15 trillion instead of just 9 trillion a few years ago, and it's just like, well, we're kind of incrementally going the wrong way. I think that sometimes you see that reaction among some folks. That's pretty disappointing. On the other hand, folks that follow this issue closely realize just the vast amount of debt that we've piled on just in the last 3 years, for instance. Like the statistic I gave, take George Washington up till George W. Bush, and you wouldn't have accumulated that much debt in our entire history, and we have in the last 3 years. That really strikes some people when you put it in that type of context. If you just look at the pure numbers of it, some people will not understand. If you talk about it that way, people will understand. And I think that people are ready to do something about it, because when we work, we work primarily with state legislators, but when we work with members of Congress and the like too, they realize that this is a big threat to the future of our country in terms of our future prosperity and our future outlook. They realize that it's a future to passing on the type of lifestyle that we've enjoyed to our kids and our grandkids in the future. That's really in jeopardy now. Over the years, America has always increased our standard of living, going from one generation to another. Maybe for the first time in the American experiment, we are risking the fact that the next generation and the generation after may be having a lower standard of living than we enjoyed, because we've racked up the credit cards, and now all of a sudden they have to start paying for we've been spending over the last several decades, especially since the Great Society and the New Deal over the last century. We have a real situation where that may happen, and I don't want to be doom and gloom, because I think there's a lot of bright spots ahead. I think if we right the ship in terms of competitiveness, there is a lot of optimism in terms of what growth can do. If the American economy starts producing, 5% annual GDP growth, what that can do to get us out of the problem we're in is huge. That's one of the things that Reagan was able to capitalize on, is when he cut marginal tax rates the way he did, we saw the national growth. Of course, you had better monetary policy going on at the time as well than we have today. We have a real concern with printing of money and inflation going on. But I think that if we get growth right, if we get competitiveness right, there is some mitigation of this current trajectory that we're on that is a bit doom and gloom sounding. And so I think that is waking a lot of folks up. And among some of the legislators, especially the ones that believe in the ideas we believe in, they think this is crisis mode, that we must start righting the ship at this point before it goes to autopilot, and before we cross that line of the bridge too far and we keep going in that direction where it's kind of too late.
Good. Last question.
Last question.
Getting back to your point about the states being laboratories for experimentation, and this gentleman's point about people not caring, it seems part of the function of people not caring is their belief in their inability to influence a leviathan like the federal government, whereas at the state or local level you have more of an opportunity to be of influence. In that line, what do you think of Tom Wood's theory of revitalizing the theory of nullification, where you're not dependent like we are now on a Supreme Court, 5 people who may tell us Obamacare is unconstitutional? Wouldn't it have been more effective for those states' attorney generals to say that law has no effect because it is unconstitutional? You would have then had 26 states which would have said Obamacare is unconstitutional. Well, under the 10th Amendment, that's their right.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that's a very good point, and I think it's something that our state legislators That point's not lost on them. They understand that they do have power, they should have power under the 10th Amendment, but more directly, they do have power under Article 5 of the Constitution, where the states can come together for the purpose of proposing amendments directly to bypass Congress. That was one of the great things that our founders put into our American Constitution, is that we do have the option of the states going directly to a amendment process without Congress, and that's something that must happen. One of the Article 5 approaches that I like is something called the repeal amendment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. We do talk about it briefly in this Article 5 guide that is on the back table. This is something that Randy Barnett, who is a Cato Institute and he's a law professor at Georgetown, but he also is affiliated with the Cato Institute in Washington, has come up with this idea. It follows along those lines, but actually enshrines in the United States Constitution directly that the states should have the power of coming together at any point, and if a majority of states come together, then any federal regulation, tax, or law could be overturned by a vote of the states. And that ought to be something that is a safety valve, a check and balance, because what we've seen is, we've seen Congress run roughshod over the states for years and years and years, and of course the 10th Amendment has become the most forgotten amendment out there today. But we do have this Article 5 process that the states still do have teeth. Now, there's some across the country that have spread quite a bit of fear over the Article 5 process, and scared a lot of people away of trying to exercise that authority under the Constitution for the states to come together and have more power and really challenge Congress and really have a balance of power, as we talked about, and challenge the Supreme Court in terms of, hey, let's just pass this as an amendment if the Supreme Court says, for instance, that interstate commerce goes for any other federal program out there. Having an enumerated powers act or something like that to say you must show what type of a constitutional power you have. But I really think that that type of solution is very viable. We must, at the very least, have Congress know that they're not going to be able to continue this, and the states are taking attention, and they do want their constitutional authority back.
Well, I think in conjunction, they also need the Supreme Court to realize that they are not the be-all and end-all in terms of what is constitutional and unconstitutional. There's no reason 5 individuals should decide our fate.
Yeah, that's obviously the dynamic that we've operated under for so long, and I think that if we were to change it where the states did have the direct power of amendment, then it does take the Supreme Court out of the equation in many cases, where if they just are ruling in a way that the states find is harmful, or in a way that damages balances of powers, and they can go up and say, hey, well, we've got this constitutional amendment. It's very hard for a court to come back and say this constitutional amendment directly addressing this issue is unconstitutional. Now, that may not stop them from trying it, but that's something that that issue has to be addressed, and the states do have to have that balance of powers reinstated. Because if we were going to have a conversation with one of our founders about this and say, well, we've had this issue where the federal government's really gotten way out of control over the years. The Supreme Court and the federal government and the executive branch have run roughshod over the states. They would probably come back and tell us, well, silly you. We wrote it right into the United States Constitution that you have the safety valve, and at any time things get out of control, you have Article 5 to say, hey, the states can come together and rectify this situation directly without the interference of Congress. And they'd probably be kind of disappointed we hadn't taken it up. We've dealt with this federal overreach for 100 years. All of a sudden, I think we're re-examining Article 5. Well, that's one of the reasons we put this guide together, and we do need to turn that power back to the states. And I think my organization happens to be in a pretty unique position to make that happen. I think we're going to be fighting very hard to make that happen.
Very good.
Great, thank you.
That's great.